This is a question that has sparked a debate for decades, perhaps centuries even, and the debate is not settled till date. Is one person's terrorist another person's freedom fighter? And if you're wondering why I'm raising this question, then listen to me very carefully. I have a list of names. Mahatma Gandhi, Bhagat Singh, Subhash Chandra Bose, Sukhdev, Rajguru, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Rosa Parks, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Lenin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, all of these iconic leaders were either charged with rebellion, inciting civil strife, or terrorism during their lives. And most of them are now hailed as leaders who stood for their people, who fought for their liberty. So it is settled that this definition changes with time. History is written by the winners. So maybe this shows that these leaders are vindicated by time and the world has largely accepted their ideas. But the debate continues nevertheless. So to end imperialism and global terrorism, the United Nations came into existence after the Second World War. What does the UN say about this issue? And let me quote from the FAQ page of the United Nations. There is a question specifically. Has the UN agreed on a single definition of terrorism? The answer is no. The UN doesn't have a single definition, and the reason is this. An unequivocal definition of terrorism would remove the political distinction that some make between the actions of so-called freedom fighters and terrorists. So to find out one definition, they set up a panel many years ago. And that panel, by the way, is still debating. Where do we draw the line then? Ideological compulsions add another layer of complexity. Several leftist and anarchist leaders often get tagged as terrorists during their lifetime. The complexity attains massive proportions in today's world of nation states. A state represents the people. Now, statistics argue that violent attacks on the state or attempts to destabilize states amounts to terrorism. There is a riposte to this. Leftist leaders like Joseph Stalin have overseen some of the biggest curbs on people. He was a communist dictator, all right, but every form of dissent was brutally suppressed. Several activists and rivals were killed. Now, Stalin was the state. He did not oppose the Soviet state. Should he be called a dictator or a terrorist or a revolutionary? States, like culture, are not constant entities. They evolve with time. And the geographic boundaries, the identities, all these aspects of state constantly change. It is a dynamic equilibrium. So I come back to the same question. Where do we draw the line? It is safe to tag attempts that hurt civilians as acts of terror. And then again, the flip side of the argument is that this definition prevents any armed protest against the state. But armed protest against an established force of a state is different from acts of sabotage. A classic example was Prabhakaran, the man who headed the LTTE. In the 1980s, India viewed Prabhakaran as a fighter for the rights of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. The LTTE even found support from the political establishment in India as well as the state of Tamil Nadu. But by 1993, it became infamous for assassinating leaders like Rajiv Gandhi in India and Ranasange Premadasa in Sri Lanka. Now, it was branded as a terrorist group after these assassinations. The LTTE recruited children for their fight against the Sinhalese army. What's worse, they used some of them as suicide bombers. They morphed into a terrorist outfit. The tricky thing here is this. An organization like the LTTE at one point projected itself as the movement that stands against the oppression of an ethnic group, the Tamils in Sri Lanka. The oppression was real. So organizations like the UN view these groups with the tinted glass of oppression, and that only gives a wrong perspective. Fight against oppression, fight for independence is different from attacks on normal civilians. So can a death toll be a marker? Again, that will leave out the intentions. This is a very, very tricky terrain. Before movements crystallize into terrorist outfits, the intentions are visible. Any attack on the basis of racist, ethnic, territorial, linguistic, religious or color can be called a terrorist attack. Put simply, attacks fueled by white supremacy or anti-Semitism is also terrorism, just as attacks triggered by religious fundamentalism of any religion. Extremism is different though, and that's the fight for extreme views in an extreme fashion, but any act that spreads the regime of terror must be called an act of terror. What about the identity battle? In today's world, there are chances at spreading a view. The technological revolution allows this in most of the countries. The battle for identity, which sometimes expands to an armed fight for freedom, needs to be fought with sanity. An attitude to make the battle an armed struggle will only spread terror.